Chapter 1, 1999. Derek stepped out onto the streets of Washington, D.C., the late autumn air crisp against his skin. The city hummed with its usual static, honking cabs, murmured conversations, and the occasional bass drop from some passing car's subwoofers. It was 1999, and he was 19, officially a college dropout, though he hadn't bothered to make it official. He had paid out of pocket for that first semester, hoping maybe he'd find a purpose, but that hope had fizzled fast. College wasn't for him. The only lectures he enjoyed were the ones over drinks at house parties, and he had no interest in wasting time in a classroom when he could be living instead. And living, at least for now, meant finding a way to stretch his cash until he figured out his next move. That's how he found himself heading toward a clinic offering $50 for a simple physical. $50 for doing absolutely nothing? That was absurd. He had done physicals for football in high school. They took, 10 minutes. A quick checkup, maybe some awkward ball cupping, and boom, $50 in his pocket. He could make that stretch for weeks, keep the party rolling a little longer before the real world caught up to him. His frosted tips were freshly done, the bleach still stinging his scalp a little, but he looked good. At least, he thought so. The look had gone a little out of style, but in his mind, he was still pulling it off. And maybe, just maybe, the nurse at this place would be hot. That would be the real win of the day. Normally, something like this would have set off alarms for Derek. He wasn't an idiot. He had a keen nose for scams, and he sure as hell wasn't about to get kidnapped over some shady deal. But the world was weirder than it had ever been, and a clinic handing out cash for health data wasn't even close to the strangest thing going on. Since 1990, when Hubble launched, humanity had learned more about its cosmic surroundings than ever before. Space was big, but more importantly, it wasn't empty. A few months ago, the guys at SETI had gone through old data and found something. Something big. A message. Derek had always been a huge alien guy, UFOs, men in black, the whole conspiracy-laden works. He had loved the idea that the government was secretly in contact with extraterrestrials, hiding some grand cosmic truth just beneath the surface. But when the first contact actually happened, it ruined everything. The leaked footage and classified files didn't reveal a shadowy cabal pulling the strings, it showed that nobody, not even the so-called experts, knew a damn thing. The very first confirmed alien message wasn't some deep disclosure or an intergalactic handshake. It was just a desperate, ominous warning, proof that humanity wasn't special, wasn't chosen, and worst of all, wasn't prepared. The mystery wasn't fun anymore. The forums had been wild, speculating, panicking, theorizing. But then the truth? The truth was worse than anyone expected and boring. The beacon was splashed across every major newspaper's front page. A massive black box, drifting in space, cold and ancient. No markings, no signals of intelligence beyond its mere presence. It sat in the void, waiting. And the message it repeated? That was the part that sent the world into a spiral. The universe is not safe. If you can see me, hide. You may be too late. Something dwells in the darkness of the lake of stars. That was it. The same sentence, repeating endlessly, transmitted from a machine light years away, older than human civilization itself. An answering machine left behind by something that had tried to warn us. That warning alone had been enough to collapse governments. The Soviet Union, once thought a relic of the past, rapidly reformed as former republics clung to the idea of unity in the face of cosmic doom. Most of Africa consolidated into the Pan-African Front, pooling resources to secure their own future amidst global instability. Meanwhile, Canada, China, and Mexico fractured into warring city-states, their governments collapsing under the weight of infighting and resource hoarding. Europe, as always, was a chaotic mess, with shifting alliances and leaders changing hands like a game of musical chairs. The United States, in true American fashion, had thrown a massive party. It was a full-blown "we're all gonna die" bash that lasted a month straight. Derek had loved every second of it. After all, nothing had actually changed. The world still turned, the internet still buzzed, and the bars still served drinks. But not everyone moved on so easily. The forums were already filled with fresh doomsday theories, especially with the looming specter of Y2K hanging over everything. What if this wasn't just an alien warning? What if it was tied to the collapse of human civilization? What if we had already been found? Then there were the escapists. A cult, at least, that's what most people called them. Derek had seen their recruiters around campus, handing out flyers and giving impassioned speeches about how humanity had already lost. They believed the warning was real and that the only way to survive was to leave Earth entirely. To pool the planet's resources into building an ark, launching it far away, and starting over before it was too late. It was a pipe dream, obviously, but they had believers, and their numbers were growing. Derek hadn't given them much thought. The recruiter on campus had been hot, though, and that was enough to make him stop and listen. Now, as he pushed open the glass doors to the clinic, he was glad to see that his instincts had been right. The nurse at the front desk? Very, very hot. He grinned, stepping up to the counter. Hey there. I'm here for the, physical? The $50 one? She barely glanced up from her clipboard, pushing a pen toward him. Sign in. Take a seat. Not exactly the warm welcome he was hoping for, but whatever. He scribbled his name, found a chair, and settled in, his fingers drumming idly against his knee. The clinic was quiet, unnervingly so. No background music. Just the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of papers behind the desk or cough of a waiting man. Maybe he should have been a little more wary. But $50 was $50. And the world hadn't ended yet. So what was the worst that could happen? Derek stepped out of the clinic, $50 tucked into his wallet, and took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. The doctor had been weirdly enthusiastic about his physical, practically beaming as he jotted down Derek's results. Perfect health, truly excellent condition, he had said more than once. It wasn't like the place was hurting for participants, the waiting room had been packed, but the way the doctor looked at him, like he'd just found a rare specimen, put an extra pep in Derek's step. Even the nurse had noticed, giving him a small amused smile as she handed over his paperwork. Not that Derek needed the validation. He already knew he was hot. He had always known. 6 feet tall, lean but muscular, and a face that had never had trouble catching attention. The confirmation from a medical professional just made it official. Now, with cash in hand and a week of partying ahead before fall break, he felt like he was on top of the world. If he played his cards right, he might even make it through the semester without having to get a job. Derek knew leaving the frat party was the right move. It had been a disaster, a total sausage fest. Too many dudes, not enough girls, and way too many bad attempts at shotgunning beer. He bailed, heading down the street to a bar where the drinks were cheap, and the bouncers didn't care enough to check IDs. The night was shaping up nicely. A couple of drinks in, he was chatting with Jason, a guy he had met through the frat circuit but wasn't particularly close with. The two of them stood at the edge of the bar, lazily scanning for potential hookups. Then Derek saw her. The nurse from the clinic. Tina. She was sitting at a high-top table with a couple of friends, laughing, her dark hair falling effortlessly over her shoulders. She looked even better than she had at the clinic, and Derek, half buzzed and fully confident, made his move. Jason was mid-sentence when Derek clapped him on the back and abandoned the conversation, striding toward Tina with a grin. She was genuinely happy to see him. That was the first good sign. They fell into easy conversation, and he learned she was a nursing student with a background in science. Gorgeous and smart. A rare combination where Derek was from. Derek had grown up in a small town with few opportunities for meeting women like her. The moment he could leave, he had, searching for something more exciting, something beyond the confines of the predictable life he had known. And right now, that excitement was sitting across from him, smiling, touching his arm when she laughed. One drink turned into 2, then 3, and when she suggested heading back to his dorm, he could hardly believe his luck. The night was perfect. Until it wasn't. They were walking to her car, the alcohol making the cold air feel distant, when a cloth pressed over his mouth and nose. Derek's world spun. The scent was sickly sweet, chemical. He thrashed, but hands held him firm. Darkness swallowed him. The next thing he knew, he was in a car, a sack over his head, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. Voices murmured around him, indistinct, blending with the sound of tires on pavement. Then, nothing. When he woke, everything was white. Bright sterile lights. Cold metal restraints biting into his wrists and ankles. The walls were tiled, too clean, almost artificial. A one-way mirror loomed across from him, reflecting his own dazed expression. Derek tried to move, but his body was sluggish, drugged. He could barely roll his eyes, let alone sit up. His tongue felt thick, his throat dry. A door hissed open, and masked figures in sterile suits stepped through an airlock. They moved methodically, ignoring him as they adjusted machines, checked monitors. Derek struggled to form words, to ask what was happening, but his voice wouldn't cooperate. He was awake, but barely. Conscious enough to know something was terribly wrong, but too weak to do anything about it. He tried again. Help. No reaction. The figures moved with detached precision, their faces hidden behind masks. Panic crept up his spine. Where the hell was he? And what the hell had he just gotten himself into? So what was the worst that could happen? Derek punished himself internally. Chapter 2. Even though Derek couldn't move, he could still see. His eyelids fluttered weakly, the effort to keep them open monumental. His mind was clearing faster than his body, a disjointed sensation that left him wondering if this was some kind of sleep paralysis dream. He'd read about those in Psych 101. But this felt too real. It lasted too long. The first thing he noticed was his own reflection staring back at him from an obvious two-way mirror. He was strapped down to a table, the restraints biting into his wrists and ankles. Behind him, beyond the mirror, was a glass window leading to something far worse. He could just make out the view, a space cluttered with pipes, frost-rimed metal, and a claustrophobic coffin-like chamber. What the actual fuck? His mind reeled, grasping for any explanation. The last thing he remembered was leaving the bar, Tina's laugh, the cold air, and then a hand clamping over his face, the smell of something chemical. Now he was here. Wherever here was. His senses were returning in pieces. First, his sight, then his hearing. Voices drifted in, distorted at first, before sharpening into clear conversation. The sound wasn't coming from inside the room, but from overhead. There was an open mic somewhere, a direct feed between the unseen observers behind the glass and the workers moving in and out of his room. They weren't bothering to hide their words. Subject 77 is stable, one voice said. Time restraints are getting tighter, another voice responded, irritated. We don't have time to do this by the book anymore. Fuck regulations, a third voice chimed in. Things have changed. We need to move. Subject 77. That's me, Derek realized with a slow horror. They were talking about him like he wasn't even there. Another voice, closer this time. Physical compatibility is perfect. No pre-existing conditions, optimal metabolic function. 105 IQ, peak normal genome. A walking reboot. The genome here is ideal, mixed race, broad variance, resilient lineage. Exactly what they would need to refresh the system. Derek tried to croak something out, anything. His throat was too dry, his tongue thick, but eventually, a weak, broken noise escaped. A ragged plea. The intercom crackled. The voices, mid-discussion, faltered. He's awake? There was a pause. Shit. He shouldn't be yet. Another voice, calmer. It doesn't matter. Just breathe, Subject 77. That's all we need from you right now. Derek's pulse pounded in his ears. No. No, no, no. His body was still useless, but his mind was screaming. He tried again, his voice raw. Stop. Please. Let me go. But his words were ignored. A mechanical hiss filled the chamber as the door behind him unlatched. A rush of air so cold it felt like knives against his antiseptically scrubbed skin poured in, making his breath hitch violently in his throat. His body convulsed in place, his muscles too weak to resist but still feeling every bit of the agony. The air stung like acid. Figures in hazmat suits moved with mechanical precision, their boots clanking against the metal floor. The airlock hissed open behind them, another rush of sterile, freezing air cutting through the room as more figures entered. They moved in pairs, synchronized, like they had done this 100 times before. One checked Derek's vitals with a handheld scanner, murmuring something in a clipped tone to his partner, who nodded and adjusted a device on his wrist. Another figure took his arm, adjusting the restraints with an almost casual efficiency. Derek felt his body shift under their grip, powerless, a puppet whose strings had been cut. All readings stable, one of them muttered. He's coming out of it faster than expected. Doesn't matter now. Move him. Hands gripped him, lifting, shifting. Derek's numb body was dragged toward the open chamber behind him. The cold was immediate, biting even through his dulled senses, a stark warning of what was coming next. No, no, wait, his protests were breathless, garbled, but still, they ignored him. The moment his bare back touched the chamber's interior, every nerve screamed in protest. The metal was ice, so cold it burned. Derek gasped, instinctively trying to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. The suits shoved him inside, forcing his limbs against the frozen walls. The glass door hissed shut. Derek's breath came fast, too fast. He could already see his exhalations fogging up the small window before him. On the other side, figures watched. One of them chuckled darkly, voice echoing through the intercom. If they ever have to wake him up, he'll be in paradise compared to what's coming. Then, silence. A mechanical hiss sounded as gas flooded into the chamber. Derek's first inhale burned, sharp, chemical, thick. He coughed, his lungs seizing as the cold tore through him. He gasped again, and the pain only worsened. His body fought, panicked, twisting against the unyielding walls of his metal tomb. This is it. His mind flashed back to his Nan, her cigarette-roughened voice warning him when he was a kid, "You can never trust doctors, boy. The ones that ain't trying to cheat you out of your money wanna treat you like a lab monkey, cut you up and put you down." She ashed a cigarette after finishing, and she had been right. All he had ever wanted was to see more than that shitty trailer park he grew up in. Now, less than a year later, he was trapped in some government nightmare. His body numbed. His thoughts slowed. The cold wasn't just in his skin anymore, it was sinking deeper, pressing against his skull, creeping into the spaces between his thoughts. He tried to hold on to something, anything, a memory, a word, but the cold took that too. It was like his brain was shutting down one piece at a time, the signals slowing, then stopping entirely. His last thought wasn't even a full sentence, just a fragment, cut off mid-form like a flickering light winking out before it could finish spelling disaster. Then, nothing. Derek didn't know when he started dreaming, just that he did. It was a thick, syrupy kind of dream, like thinking through oil. Slow, heavy. At first, he wasn't sure if he was dreaming at all. Maybe he was just remembering, because he knew this dream. It had been with him for as long as he could recall. He was in the sandbox outside the trailer. The one from that day. His stepfather had locked him outside, a punishment for something small, something meaningless. 3 or 4 years old, alone in the heat, the plastic of the sandbox searing his bare legs, the sand inside dry and scratchy. The sun was relentless, hammering down from an unforgiving southern sky. His throat had been dry then, too, lips cracked, skin burning in slow agony. In reality, he had spent hours out there, waiting for his mother's car to return home. But here, in the dream, it stretched on forever. The light shifted in unnatural ways, the sun spinning through the sky at impossible speeds. Shadows stretched and shrank, whipping around him like living things. Derek lay in the box, still as death, watching the sky twist, his stomach rolling at the motion. The noises started next, muffled at first, then sharper. Not words he could hear or understand, not at first. Just sounds like distant explosions, like someone had hit fast forward on a VHS tape. Then the rain came. At first, just a slow, rhythmic tapping against the plastic shell of the sandbox. Barely there. Then stronger. He should have welcomed it, but it wasn't right. He had dreamed this dream before, and it had never rained before. A low wind slithered through the air, carrying a strange hissing sound. And beneath that, voices. Clearer than they had ever been in this dream before. 3 of them. The first 2 were young, a boy and a girl, probably preteens, their voices carrying a weird brokenness, like they were struggling to shape the words. The third was older, a woman, her voice more composed, measured. The children spoke first, their words warped and twisted with a dialect Derek had never heard before. "See, miss, we find tunnel long time ago. Hide-seek place. Now you ask where glow-painted holy man is, we take you here for the food slimes you promise." The woman responded in clearer English, her voice steady, almost reverent. "Hush, children. Patience rewards the virtuous. I paid you to take me to this man for a reason. This text explains how to free the ancient from the painting. Watch over the entrance while I follow the will of our martyred lady and unbind him." The hissing sound grew sharper. Metal clinking. The smell of rust. Then, pain. A sharp, biting cold spread through his body like liquid nitrogen rushing through his veins. Derek's eyes shot open. He wasn't in the sandbox anymore. He was back in the coffin. His body convulsed as he sucked in a breath, choking as something thick and wet filled his throat. His lungs burned as he coughed violently, spilling icy fluid from his mouth. Every nerve in his body screamed as he lurched forward, his muscles barely responding. He was awake. The chamber door groaned, rust flaking off ancient hinges. A cracking noise, then a snap. Something heavy collapsed with a wet clunk. Derek fell with it. The children screamed. His body hit the cold metal of the door, flopping limply onto the grated floor. He was still too weak to move properly, his limbs twitching uselessly as he struggled for air. His ears rang from the echoing cries of the children, their voices bouncing around the space in a way that made his brain throb. The lighting was wrong, too dim, too distant. His vision swam, but none of that mattered. Because Derek couldn't breathe. No, it was worse than that. He didn't want to breathe. Every inhale was thick, rotten. The air was wrong, humid to the point of suffocation. The smell clawed its way into his sinuses, something that was sweat, mold, and the reek of human filth baked into metal for generations. It was like breathing in the mouth of a corpse. Derek retched violently, vomiting up what little remained inside him. The bile splattered against the grated floor, slipping through the cracks and dribbling onto the fallen chamber door beneath him. His stomach spasmed as another wave of sickness took hold, his body rejecting the very air around him. Slowly, his lungs adjusted, though every breath still felt like he was swallowing something thick and foul. The acrid taste of decay and stale sweat coated the back of his throat. His nose burned, the stench overwhelming, until finally, mercifully, his senses dulled, as if his body had just given up trying to process the filth. The children had stopped screaming. Derek forced himself to focus, blinking against the dimness. Two figures stood just at the edge of the light, watching him, their small frames rigid with fear. He could hear their breathing, quick and nervous. He swallowed hard, tasting the rancid air again. His body ached as he forced himself upright, his muscles protesting with every inch. The children didn't move as he sat up. They just watched. And Derek had no idea what the hell was waiting for him beyond the dark. Chapter 3. He gagged, dry heaving until his ribs ached. The air itself felt like an attack, thick and humid, suffocating his lungs with every breath. Even after the adjustment. The children still stared, open-mouthed, barely blinking as Derek struggled to adjust. Their wide eyes reflected the cold light pouring from his chamber, flickering like animal eyes in the dark. He would have stayed hunched there, waiting for his body to stop revolting against existence under its own weight, if not for the hand. It was sticking out from beneath the door he had collapsed onto. Pale. Limp. The fingers curled just slightly, frozen in some last twitching grasp, and clutched between them was something strange, a book, or what barely passed as one. The binding was an ugly patchwork, full of cut-out pages and folded scraps jammed together, bulging in places where too much paper had been forced into too little space. Derek blinked, his breath catching. What the fuck? The reality of it hit all at once. The door had crushed someone. Someone had been here when he fell out of the chamber. Someone had died beneath him. The nausea returned in a violent wave. Derek scrambled to his feet on pure instinct, legs weak and trembling, his head swimming with dizziness. He barely kept his balance, his vision swimming. His muscles felt like they hadn't been used in weeks, maybe longer. The children still hadn't moved, but his sudden motion made them shrink back into the dark, their small forms barely visible now, only the eerie pinpricks of their reflected eyes remained. Derek swallowed hard and reached down, fingers numb and shaking, as he pried the book from the dead hand. The grip was loose, already fading, and the book came free with a soft rustle of paper. He stepped off the door onto the grated catwalk, and the entire structure shuddered. A deafening groan echoed into the cavernous dark, metal shrieking against metal. The entire walkway trembled beneath him, rattling violently. Derek's stomach lurched as his weight shifted unpredictably, forcing him to throw his arms out for balance. He made a mistake. His hands grabbed for the railings, and the whole catwalk wobbled dangerously. His knees buckled, his balance going out from under him. He barely caught himself before he tumbled over the edge, and when he did, he looked down. And instantly wished he hadn't. The catwalk was suspended over a massive void. The drop below him disappeared into pitch blackness, an abyss so deep and empty that his mind couldn't fully comprehend it. He had no idea how far it went, only that falling would be the end of him. He clutched the book tighter, his breath quickening. The children, meanwhile, remained unfazed. They didn't flinch at the rumbling. They didn't even seem concerned about the precarious height. Their small feet stood firm on the rusting iron platform ahead, watching him with something between curiosity and suspicion. Slowly, tentatively, Derek adjusted his footing, moving like a cat testing an unstable surface. His legs still felt weak, but he forced himself to move forward, carefully transferring his weight onto the more solid section of the walkway where the kids stood. As he approached, he held the book out an offering, his voice hoarse as he tried to explain. I didn't mean to, I don't know what happened. I didn't kill them. The children didn't react right away. Their faces remained unreadable, but when they finally spoke, their voices came out in that same broken, stilted cant. Stay back from us, the boy warned, his body shifting slightly in front of the girl. That text killed the lady with the foodstuffs. We don't want it. The man from the glow painting should keep it. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest like a child trying to imitate an adult. I'm Z, good boy of the church, not thief. This my not blood page, but she good too. He jabbed a thumb toward his companion, who nodded sharply. We do right, we listen. We no spend minutes on bad talk. Paige, smaller and thinner, spoke up with a wary glance at Derek's hands. Church says glow man need keep words safe. Words got danger. Derek's stomach twisted further. The way they spoke, the way they looked at him, it wasn't just fear. It was something more. Like they were looking at something out of a myth, something dangerous. He tried to push past his growing panic, to slow down, to focus. I don't understand, he said, running a hand over his face. His head was starting to throb, whether from the lack of oxygen or the sheer confusion, he couldn't tell. What does that mean? Where are we? The children exchanged glances, almost hesitant. Finally, the girl, Paige, he thought, based on how the boy looked at her, spoke, though her expression twisted like she didn't understand the question. We in tunnel. For hide-seek. Derek blinked. His throat was dry. Tunnel? Paige nodded, looking more confused now. Yeah. Tunnel. Derek exhaled sharply. He wasn't getting anywhere with this. His head hurt too much to try to piece together their warped logic. He forced himself to focus on something simpler. I need to get out of here, he said, slowly. Can you take me to someone in charge? Someone who can help? The two kids perked up slightly at the idea of leaving, only for the boy, Z, to frown again. He hesitated, then muttered, You too big for way back. Derek frowned. What? The way we go, Z explained. Small. Big man can't fit. Derek looked between them, realization dawning like a slow horror. They were his only chance at getting out of here. But the way back, the only way they knew, was too small for him to fit through. Which meant he was trapped. He turned, glancing back at the coffin-like chamber he had stumbled from, its dim glow still casting eerie light into the surrounding dark. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of unease curling through his gut. A cryochamber. The kind he had only ever seen in sci-fi movies. Who knew how long he had been inside that thing? His gaze drifted to the door, still lying at an angle on the grated walkway, the dead hand still visible beneath it. His stomach twisted. Wait. He turned back to the kids. That lady, you said she was a lady, right? She must have been too big as well, right? How did she get in here? Z and Paige exchanged glances, their small faces unreadable in the dim light. There was a long pause before Z finally muttered, Gotta go through Oblock 3. Without Our Lady, hard. Paige's expression shifted, her brow furrowing in thought. Then a sly smile crept onto Z's face. He nudged his sister, whispering something too low for Derek to catch. The two schemed for a moment, their words fast and hushed, before Paige turned to Derek, eyes flicking up and down his frame with something close to wonder. Look at how he dressed, Z said, grinning now. Glowman blend into Oblock 3 easy. Paige nodded eagerly. Best dressed man I ever seen. Derek blinked. He looked down at himself, taking in the thin, threadbare hospital gown draped over his body. The fabric was cheap and barely holding together, and it was presumably new, its whiteness marred with grime from the floor. He looked like hell. What? What do you mean best dressed? Derek's eyes had adjusted slowly to the dim light now as he took a closer look at the two kids standing before him. Now that he wasn't just trying to stay upright, he could truly see them, and what he saw made his stomach twist. Their clothes weren't just dirty. They were something else entirely. It was like they had been pulled from a landfill and left to rot on their backs. Shorts and a t-shirt that may have once been white, now a stained, greasy, threadbare mess of fabric clinging to their small, pale bodies. The cloth sagged unnaturally, damp with sweat, oil, and grime, as though the very air around them refused to let anything stay dry. Derek had seen poverty, he'd grown up in it, but this was something worse. This was survival on the edge of nothing. Compared to them, he was practically a king. His hospital gown was little more than a thin scrap of cloth, but it was intact. It didn't sag, didn't stick to him in layers of filth. He was clean, even after collapsing onto the grating. That realization made him shudder. Why was he clean? He shoved the thought aside, tucking the book he had taken from the dead woman into his waistband. Moving toward the kids, he expected them to shy away again, but this time they didn't. They let him step closer, and for the first time, he saw just how small they were. Malnourished. Stunted. More like ghosts than children. It was almost worse than the smell, the suffocating humidity, the stale, rotting air thick enough to coat the back of his throat. It was seeing them like this, underfed, pale, limbs too thin for their bodies, that made his gut twist. Derek exhaled, rubbing his arms, checking himself over. The trio now stood on a more stable section of catwalk, but he had no mirror, no reflection to catch his own face. He ran his fingers through his hair and felt it still, frosted tips, perfect, still as he remembered them. Whatever had happened to him, however long it had been, he was still himself. The catwalk groaned beneath them. The kids barely reacted, but Derek did, flinching as the metal groaned and shifted under his feet. He looked down at the rust-covered iron and suddenly felt the weight of everything pressing in on him. We should go back to Oblock 3, Z muttered, pointing ahead. Much longer walk than the tunnel. Derek followed the motion, saw the small broken pipe opening in the wall. He stared. The kids had been crawling inside that? It was barely big enough for their tiny, underfed bodies, much less his. The thought of forcing himself through that tight, claustrophobic space made his skin crawl. No way. Z didn't wait. He turned on bare feet, stepping off the catwalk, moving across the rusted floor like he'd done it 1,000 times. Derek hesitated before following, wincing as his own feet pressed against the grime-covered metal. It was thick, oily, caking between his toes, a mixture of rust, dirt, and something else he didn't want to think about. This whole place was built underground. That much was obvious now. It wasn't built for comfort, just function. Cold, industrial, cheap. The hallways they moved into were more of the same, walls stripped of whatever insulation they may have once had, panels missing, wires torn out or rerouted. It reminded Derek of a set for a sci-fi show, except if the ship had been gutted by scavengers and left to rot. There was something skeletal about it all. The way it stretched on, the way even the floor had been stripped up in places, panels missing, the exposed underlayers dark and gaping. This place wasn't just old. It had been picked over. Stripped. Derek glanced at the ground. Footprints dotted the grime, but none of them were recent. This tunnel, Derek tried again, his voice hoarse. Where does it actually lead? The kids exchanged glances, their pale faces unreadable. Finally, Z spoke. Near Oblak 3. Derek exhaled slowly. Right. And where is that? Paige blinked at him, frowning. Then, after a moment, her eyes widened slightly in realization. He means Terra. She clapped a hand over her mouth as soon as she said it, like she had spoken something forbidden. Z hissed sharply beside her, shaking his head. Don't spend minutes on bad talk, he snapped. Derek felt his breath catch. Terra. He knew that name. It was Earth. It was home. He was still on Earth. Relief surged through him for a moment, until he noticed the way the two kids cowered away from his reaction, eyes darting, bodies tense like they expected something bad to happen. He let the moment pass. Let his mind settle. Wherever he was, whatever was going on, he still had a chance of finding fresh air. Of seeing the sky. Of figuring out what the hell had happened to put him here. Pushing his luck, he asked, so where on Terra is Oblak 3? The children shrank further, curling into themselves. Neither would answer. Derek sighed. He'd have to drop it. Instead, he let them lead. Z spoke again after a long, cautious pause. We take you to good operator at the church. He help kids. Help us. He'll like to talk to glow painting man. Derek frowned. Glow painting man? Neither elaborated. Instead, they kept walking. They moved through the maze of corridors for what felt like 30 minutes, maybe more. Without the kids, Derek would have wandered in circles, lost in the dim tunnels. The light reminded him of emergency flood lighting, the kind that kicked on in power outages, but most of the bulbs were dead, leaving only a scattered glow to guide them. As they walked, Z and Paige bickered, their strange dialect making it hard to follow. But Derek did his best to piece it together. Paige wasn't happy. She didn't like the way Derek talked. The way he asked things. Z, meanwhile, seemed less worried. Operator say it minutes of caller, not answerer, he muttered. Just don't bad talk at him, Paige. Like Our Lady. Derek had no idea what that meant. Then, ahead, light. Real light. Not bright, not as strong as he would have liked, but something. The exit of the tunnel was ahead, an opening leading to something outside this metal maze. Derek had to stop himself from running toward it. Then Z hissed at him. The urgency in the kid's voice sent a jolt of adrenaline through Derek's gut. He froze, falling into a crouch alongside them. The three of them moved to the side of the tunnel's exit, pressing against the cold metal wall. Peering out into the light, nothing could have prepared Derek for what he saw next. Derek's pupils contracted violently as the light struck him, a searing whiteness that felt like a physical blow. He threw an arm over his eyes, hissing through clenched teeth. For a moment, the world reduced to a muffled roar, not just noise, but a pressure, like standing too close to a jet engine. His eardrums throbbed. His skull vibrated. The rumble he'd mistaken for distant machinery in the tunnels now revealed itself as something alive, primal, a chorus of human chaos crammed into a space never meant to hold it. When his vision adjusted, he wished it hadn't. Oblak 3 wasn't a building or a place. It was a tumor. Soviet-era brutalism fused with apocalyptic decay, its concrete slabs stacked like rotten teeth, leaning drunkenly into a smog-choked sky. The structure stretched upward into a haze of particulate filth, vanishing into a ceiling of greasy smoke that pulsed faintly with reflected industrial light. No sun. No sky. Just the suffocating weight of human stench and the building's own exhalations, black vapor bleeding from cracks in its facade. But it was the people that froze Derek's blood. They clotted every available inch of the shared porches that ribbed the building's exterior, their bodies crammed into doorless thresholds like barnacles on a sinking ship. At first glance, he thought they were wearing costumes, some deranged mashup of 1960s NASA cast-offs and Victorian grave robbers' finery. Space helmets, cracked and yellowed, sat atop heads swaddled in moth-eaten scarves and leather goggles. Pressure suits hung in tatters, patched with burlap and duct tape, their once white fabric stained the gray-brown of old bandages. Others wore no suits at all, just helmets strapped haphazardly over threadbare sweaters or dresses that might have been fashionable during the Cold War. Every last one of them stared at him. No, not at him. Through him. Their eyes, when he could see them at all, were milky and unfocused, pupils dilated to black pits even in the harsh light. They stood unnaturally still, limbs cocked at angles that suggested broken marionettes, their hands clutching rusted tools, frayed cables, or nothing at all. Each wore a lanyard around their neck, plastic badges dangling like talismans. Derek squinted. The closest one's badge read Oblak 3 custodial staff in peeling repainted letters, beneath a faded logo of a dove carrying a wrench. Jesus Christ, Derek muttered. The smell hit him fresh, a punch to the sinuses. Rotting meat stewed in sewage, cut with the sweet sharp tang of chemical runoff. It was the hoarder lady from his childhood trailer park multiplied by generations, by centuries of unwashed bodies and malfunctioning ventilation. He gagged, doubling over, only to jerk upright as a fresh wave of sound crashed over him. Voices. Hundreds of them. Not words, but a guttural drone, a communal hum that vibrated in his molars. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the cavernous space as if the building itself were chanting. Beneath it, Derek could make out individual threads, a woman's shrill laughter, a child's wail, the metallic clang of something heavy being dragged across concrete. The noise didn't travel. It infested, squirming through cracks in the walls, under doors that didn't exist, into the marrow of his bones. Z materialized beside him, the boy's grin stretching too wide for his gaunt face. "Welcome Oblak 3, he said, the words mangled but unmistakable. "This isn't possible," Derek breathed. But it was. The details crystallized as his brain clawed for order. The apartments were cells, bare concrete cubes with communal porches that faced each other across a narrow chasm. No doors, no privacy, just ragged curtains fluttering in the toxic breeze. The stairwells connecting the levels were death traps cobbled from rebar, plywood, and what looked like braided clothing. Entire sections hung suspended by chains, swaying gently in the thermal updrafts. And the people. Up close, their deformities were worse. Misshapen skulls, jaws jutting at bestial angles, fingers fused into claw-like mitts. Their skin had the waxy pallor of mushrooms grown in darkness, veins visible as sickly green threads. Many sported weeping sores, limbs swollen with edema, or growths that resembled barnacles. They looked less like a community and more like a single organism, a hive of mutations held together by filth and desperation. Derek's stomach twisted. He had no idea how long he had been asleep in that coffin-like chamber, but the world he had woken into was worse than any nightmare he could have imagined. This wasn't the Earth he knew. This wasn't even a place meant for humans. "Glowman, come now," Z said, tugging on Derek's arm, his voice taking on a nervous edge. "Before bad minutes happen." Derek didn't move. He couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the rusted metal beneath him, the horror before him stretching wider, darker, like a bottomless pit he was about to fall into. And then, as if the hive had sensed his hesitation, the droning chant wavered. The heads that had been staring through him turned, focusing on him. Limbs stiffened. Spines creaked. A ripple passed through the mass of bodies, a shift in posture, in weight, in something unseen but felt. Z yanked on his arm harder this time. "Glowman, move. Now." Derek swallowed hard. And he moved. As they walked, Derek could feel the weight of countless eyes on him. Some stared blankly, their pupils blown wide, while others tracked him with something closer to understanding, wariness, curiosity, or something worse. The deeper they ventured, the more apparent it became that the people of Oblak 3 weren't just poor, weren't just sick, they had been changed. He gulped as he looked up, scanning the twisted balconies above. In the dim, flickering light, he was sure he saw a figure with two heads. The thing stood motionless on a rickety scaffold, its malformed skulls craning at unnatural angles, empty sockets gaping as it watched. Derek shuddered. Hollywood mutants, he thought, something out of Mad Max, but worse. This wasn't makeup and prosthetics. This was real. Below, another scene caught his eye, just as unsettling, but in a different way. A group of children stood in a loose circle, their bodies clad in patchwork rags and what looked like old fishbowls strapped over their heads in mockeries of space helmets. Their makeshift suits sagged, duct tape and rope binding them together, the cloudy glass of their headpieces reflecting the sickly light. They weren't playing. They weren't moving, just staring down at the deflated, ruined scrap of what had once been a ball, pointing at it, giggling. Their laughter was strange, too slow, too drawn out, as if it took effort to force the sound from their lungs. The way they looked at the ruined ball was almost reverent, like it was something more than just a toy, something sacred and broken beyond repair. A creeping unease spread through Derek's chest. Whatever this place was, childhood didn't belong here. Not in any way he understood. "Glow man," Z hissed beside him in cant. "Eyes down. Walk." Derek tore his gaze away, forcing himself to look ahead. But it was too late. One of them had noticed. A figure peeled away from the shadows and stepped into their path. The man's helmet was a monstrosity, cobbled together from a plastic bucket and vacuum cleaner parts, wires and tubing trailing down his back into a bulky battery pack. His badge was still intact, swinging from his grimy neck on a lanyard. "Maintenance director." The man raised a hand, and Derek's stomach turned. His fingers were studded with extra knuckles, joints bending the wrong way as he gestured. When he spoke, his voice came in a broken, grinding rasp. "Cost sen. Cost sen." Derek stumbled back, colliding into Paige. She didn't react beyond a quick flick of her eyes between him and the crowd, reading the tension like a seasoned survivalist. "What's he saying?" Derek whispered. "Want see badge," Paige murmured. "No badge, no walk." "What badge?" "I don't." Z jabbed him sharply in the ribs. "Glow man. Use glow man power. Quick talk him." The maintenance director lurched forward, his movements jerky, mechanical, but unmistakably threatening. His malformed jaw clicked as he barked something else, words breaking apart like a corrupted file. Derek's mind scrambled. The sight of this guy, this thing, made his stomach churn. The battery pack on his back whined faintly, a high-pitched charge building with every slow step forward. Derek felt himself backing up again, instinct screaming at him to run, but the tunnels were too far. The people around them were stirring, shifting, waiting to see what he would do. He had seconds to react. His mouth opened before his brain caught up. I left it in my room, good sir?" The moment the words left his lips, the world seemed to pause. The maintenance director froze. His milky eyes twitched, his fingers flexing in unnatural ways. The wires at his back pulsed, feeding into some hidden mechanism beneath his suit. Derek felt his breath hitch. Then, the thing did something horrifying. It laughed. A garbled, staticky chortle, like a radio struggling to pick up a signal. G, good sir?" The director repeated, the phrase twisted into something mocking. "Cost sen no sir. No sir in oblak." Derek swallowed hard. His mind raced for something, anything, to get him out of this. Z gritted his teeth. "Not working," he whispered. "Talk faster." Derek balked as the realization hit him. This man thought sir and named the name Derek tried addressing him by. Cost sen's words came in fragments, barely scraping together meaning. His mouth twisted unnaturally as he tried to interpret Derek's words, chewing on them like gristle before spitting them back out, distorted and malformed. Derek's mind reeled, grasping for a way to maneuver out of this. The man's voice was thick with a broken foreign accent, less garbled than Z's cant but still far from fluent. "No badge, no walk here. Pay toll." That grin was unmistakable. Greedy. Opportunistic. His warped eyes roved hungrily over Derek's clothing, zeroing in on the fabric like a wolf sniffing out fresh meat. Derek's stomach churned. This guy wasn't just trouble, he was the toll. The realization sent adrenaline spiking through his veins. He needed to think fast. Then, he saw it. The hospital-like bracelet. The idea struck like a lightning bolt. Before he could reconsider, his mouth took control. He raised his wrist, flashing the plastic band like it was an ID badge, his voice launching into overdrive. "I am an important ambassador of the General," he declared, words spilling out like a fast-talking salesman. "Official envoy. Critical mission. The General needs me moving, needs me above, needs me clear. You gonna be the one who blocks the General's business? Gonna delay what's bigger than you? Bigger than Oblak? Bigger than all of us?" It was complete nonsense. But it worked. Cost sen's grotesque face twitched, his milky eyes flickering with hesitation. The wires snaking from his helmet pulsed once, and Derek saw the momentary lag as the man processed what had just been thrown at him. It was enough. Derek didn't wait for permission. He took a step to the side, his body moving like liquid, slipping just past the massive maintenance director's bulk. His breath caught. "Please don't stop me." Z and Paige moved instinctively, stepping with him, matching his pace exactly. The maneuver was smooth, fluid, natural. Then the murmuring started. Not from Sen, but from the watching crowd. The noise swelled, growing like a rising tide. Their wide, unfocused eyes followed Derek, their expressions vacant yet eerily knowing. He had drawn attention. Too much attention. They walked quickly as one could while trying to appear nonchalant. The rickety stairs ahead led into a labyrinth of tunnels and leaning buildings, promising something away from the oppressive mass of Oblak 3's bodies. The stairs groaned as they climbed, the metal trembling beneath their weight. Z was the first to break the silence. Glowman hit them with true speedial. His voice was filled with something close to awe. Derek blinked. "What? Speedial?" Z grinned wide. "Like operators of old. Fast talk so quick, mind can't keep up. Instant talk. You real deal Glowman." Derek had no idea what to say to that. His brain tripped over itself, searching for some meaning in what Z had just said. Then, one word stood out. Speed dial? It was the only thing in Z's tangled cant that he recognized from his old life. Speed dial? Derek repeated slowly. Z's grin widened. Glowman listen good. Like Z remember story of church and holy tapes. New Glowman have legendary powers. Paige snorted but said nothing. Derek, completely lost, decided to just roll with it. Z led the way, practically bouncing up the stairs, his energy renewed. At the top, the three of them ducked into a side tunnel, pausing for the first time to catch their breath. Derek turned back, casting one last look into the chaotic sprawl of Oblak 3. Even here, in this half-lit tunnel above the main structure, it stretched endlessly. How many people lived in this place? The thought made his skin crawl. The noise, the stink, the sheer mass of humanity crammed into every inch of space, he couldn't fathom it, and it was three of how many? Beside him, Paige exhaled shakily, rubbing a grimy hand against her sleeve. She turned to Z. We made it through Oblak 3 without the scary lady, she murmured, almost in disbelief. We did good. Glowman helped. I can't believe it. Chapter 4. As Derek and Paige walked deeper into the relative safety of the dimly lit side tunnels, Z led them forward with a confidence that seemed at odds with the twisting, decrepit pathways. The flickering lights above cast long shadows, making the rusted pipes and peeling metal panels seem alive in the half-darkness. Derek's mind was still racing, the words of the strange, malformed maintenance director still rattling in his skull. He swallowed, glancing at the two children, before breaking the silence. What do you mean you can't believe it? Derek asked, his voice still hoarse from the toxic air of Oblak 3. What was that place? And where the hell is the outside? Z and Paige both froze mid-step, gawking at him with wide, almost disbelieving eyes. Paige's face twisted further into concern, while Z, grinning since the incident with Sen, seemed almost emboldened by the question. That was Oblak 3, Z said, as if that explained everything. He puffed his chest out a little, clearly proud of something Derek couldn't quite grasp. The nobles live in rooms there. He said the word reverently, like it was some kind of sacred privilege. Families officially allowed by the creators, Z continued, voice dipping into something close to a whisper. Like the old operators. Like Glowman in the painting world. Derek narrowed his eyes, barely processing the implications. So Oblak 3 was living quarters, but it didn't take much to realize the people there had been stuck in that hellscape for far too long. He swallowed down his unease, looking between the two kids before asking the next logical question. Then, where do you two live? Z and Paige just stared at him like he had asked if water was wet. We live in Junktown 3, Z said, his voice lilting like Derek was supposed to already know what that was. Derek exhaled sharply. Okay, but you keep saying 3 at the end of things. How many of these places are there? The moment the words left his mouth, both children shrank back in visible fear. Paige looked downright sick, her already pale face going ghostly. Z's grin faltered for the first time since they'd left Oblak 3. It wasn't just confusion, it was something deeper. Like Derek had spoken a curse. The conversation ended there. They kept walking, the kids moving with an eerie silence, more adept at slipping through the rusted tunnels than any children had a right to be. Paige, who Derek was beginning to realize was much warier than Z, continued whispering in cant. Derek caught snippets, fragments of words, but he was slowly beginning to grasp more of their strange, broken language. She was nervous. Not just about their situation, but about him. She kept warning Z, something about minutes, something about dangerous words. Derek still didn't fully understand what the hell they meant by spending minutes, but whatever it was, Paige was adamant that Derek was a threat just by speaking. Finally, Z snapped. His small, malformed body turned on her, his face twisted, not just in childish frustration, but something raw, something almost fervent. "The operator Zark sent us with the scary lady," Z barked in cant, his voice echoing slightly off the corroded tunnel walls. "Because Zark knows Z good. Knows Paige good. Even though we know have place. Zark tell us scary lady not scary. Good. We'll have the voice on the tapes." Paige recoiled slightly, but Z wasn't done. "We take her to the place the tunnels lead." His voice rose, trembling with something close to desperation. "She died to make Glow Man real from the painting. This is our quest. Zark know we safe. Glow Man use power. Get us through Oblock 3. Z turned sharply, pointing at Derek. "Glow Man could get us to spend minutes on bad talk. We die soon. You see costs send big man scared. But Glow Man not use powers for bad talk. Glow Man has unlimited minutes. Needs to see Zark. We do will of the tapes and the voice." Derek could only stare at him, stunned. The child was trembling, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, quick breaths. Derek forced a smile. He nodded. Inside, his brain screamed, what the actual fuck was that? Jesus Christ. He needed to find help. Fast. Paige, still unsettled, looked between the two of them, then sighed and turned away. She didn't argue anymore. She just shook her head and muttered, "We still have to make it home." Z's expression smoothed back into something smug as he spun on his heel and led the way forward, seemingly satisfied. The group pressed on through the winding, rust-choked tunnels. Derek could still taste the stench of Oblock 3 in the back of his throat, but it was fading. Or maybe he was just losing his sense of smell. Either way, he was grateful. They walked in silence, each of them with their own thoughts. Derek had no idea what was waiting for him at the end of this, but one thing was certain. He wasn't in control of where this was going. Not anymore. As the trio walked through the tunnels in silence, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that this place was a maze, a winding labyrinth with no clear beginning or end. Everything around them was stripped down to the barest essentials, no signs, no markings, no indication of what this place had once been. Every corridor looked the same, rusted metal walls, corroded pipes, and ceilings so low in some places that he had to stoop slightly. Every couple of minutes, the world around them trembled. At first, Derek had thought the shaking was just structural instability from the decayed remains of Oblock 3, but now, in the tunnels, he realized the vibrations were continuous, almost rhythmic. A wobbling pulse, reverberating from somewhere above them, shuddering down into the depths below. It wasn't just the structure settling, this was something alive, something constant. When the tremors reached their strongest points, the tunnels groaned in protest. Rust and dust rained down, drifting in lazy plumes through the sickly dim light. Mold spores erupted from long rotted patches of decay, clouds of it bursting into the air like smoke. Derek covered his mouth instinctively, his stomach turning as the stench of mildew and something far worse filled his nose. But the strangest thing wasn't the shaking or the smell. It was Z and Paige. They barely reacted. They walked through it like it was nothing more than a passing breeze, unbothered by the tremors or the way the tunnels threatened to collapse around them. Derek felt his gut clench. The whole place felt like it was coming apart at the seams, yet these two kids just kept walking like this was an everyday occurrence. They had been walking for maybe an hour and a half since Derek had woken up, at a slow, methodical pace, but now, for the first time, Z broke the silence. "Time to rest here," Z announced abruptly, voice cutting through the tunnel's eerie stillness. Derek glanced around, confused. This spot looked no different from any other part of the tunnels. Just the same rusted-out walls, the same broken pipes, the same damp floor. Yet Z seemed certain. Before Derek could ask what made this place any different, Z hopped off the main pathway, slipping through a gap in the floor. Paige followed without hesitation, disappearing down the hole like this was routine. Derek hesitated. Then Z's head popped back up, waving him down with an impatient motion. With a sigh, Derek crouched and lowered himself through the gap. The jump down was nearly waist-high, leading into a dank, dark maintenance crawlway. The air was thick here, humid and stale, carrying the scent of rotten rust. Ahead, the kids had already crawled toward a wall where they were hoisting themselves up into another opening. They moved like they'd done this 100 times before, slipping into a space hidden in the wall. Derek followed, pulling himself up and through the tight opening. The space beyond was strange. It was larger than he expected, rectangular, with high walls and a ceiling just low enough to feel wrong. The floor bore the unmistakable marks of long-gone machinery, rusted outlines where something massive had once stood. But whatever had been here was gone, stripped away long ago. The walls themselves weren't just old, they were carved into. Metal had been taken from this place, mined down to structural weakness, leaving the area looking raw and skeletal. It had once been storage, then a resource depot. And now, it had been turned into something else. A hideaway. A place off the beaten path. The only light in the space came from a single red floodlight, dim and flickering, hidden behind a grated panel. It cast the room in a dull, hellish glow, more like dying embers than a proper light source. The air was warmer here. Slightly. Derek hadn't even realized how cold he'd been since leaving Oblok 3 until the heat hit his skin. It wasn't much, just a small reprieve, but it made the dampness of the space more bearable. The downside, however, was the mold. The humidity in the air made everything damp, and the musty scent of decay clung to the walls, stronger than anywhere else they'd been. Z and Paige wasted no time. The moment they were inside, they slumped against the metal walls, their small chests rising and falling with heavy, exhausted breaths. They were wiped out. Derek watched them for a long moment, uneasy. He didn't feel tired, not yet, anyway, but these two kids looked like they were about to pass out where they sat. Their faces were damp with sweat, their clothes sticking to their thin frames, their breathing slowing into the deep, rhythmic pattern of exhaustion. For the first time since he'd met them, they looked vulnerable. In the silence of the red-lit room, with only the distant hum of the structure's ceaseless tremors, Derek leaned back against the wall, exhaling sharply. I need to get out of here. He had no idea where he was. No idea how he'd gotten here, how long he had been asleep before waking up in that coffin of a cryochamber. And every step forward only led him deeper into a world that felt less and less human. The tunnel stretched ahead of them, winding into darkness. Somewhere out there was this arc the kids spoke of. Somewhere out there was a way out. For now, though, there was only waiting. As the kids rested, Derek felt the pressure at his waistband and remembered the scrapbook-like thing still pressed against him. He had taken it from that dead hand at the start of all this, and now, as he sat in the dim red light, he pulled it out and examined it properly for the first time. The binding was clearly handmade, stitched together with materials that didn't match. There was no title, no author's name, just an amalgamation of different pages shoved together like a desperate last attempt at preservation. Derek ran his fingers over the worn, water-damaged cover. Dozens, maybe hundreds of different books and pamphlets had been bound into this one volume. Nothing matched. Some pages were thicker, some thinner. Different fonts, different languages, different printing styles. It was as if someone had scavenged whatever they could, trying to keep something, anything, intact. As he moved closer to the weak red light, attempting to make out the text, he heard a sharp whisper from behind him. Z and Paige had gone stiff, eyes wide with something close to fear. They were whispering urgently and hissing like he'd just pulled a gun instead of a book. Paige buried her face against the metal floor, refusing to look at it, and Z kept flicking glances at Derek's hands, as if expecting the book to do something dangerous. It hit him then. They had no idea what a book was. They feared text itself. Derek swallowed hard, glancing back down at the fragile pages. It really seemed like they couldn't read. Not just that they hadn't learned, but that the concept itself was alien to them. The realization made his skin crawl. He turned back to the book and carefully opened it, the old paper threatening to crumble under his fingers. The introduction page was ornate, almost like an illuminated manuscript. Derek had taken an art history class his last and only semester, mostly in the hopes of meeting artsy girls, but it had turned out to be relatively interesting. This page, however, was something else. The writing was strange. The words were English, but they weren't. Something was off about them, the sentence structure slightly warped, like the writer hadn't had a complete grasp on the language, or any language for that matter. Derek frowned and began to read. If you are reading this, that means the art of reading has not been lost, and others beyond my family have managed to hide the art. This is my life's work. I have spent the last 50 years traveling, copying, and collecting these pieces, and this effort has cost me much. Something happened in my grandmother's time. The scientists and technology class have decided to wage a holy war. They reject science and reading, saying it leads to nothing but dread. Their people have been this way for as long as I or anyone can remember. My grandmother was a girl and the only one I know to have kept the old ideas alive. They burn everything related to teaching or reading. It is horrible to expend resources like that. This entire book is a tribute to my grandmother and is titled as such. A saying from her grandmother's time. A memory of a memory now. If only we had a user's manual. My grandmother and no one I've dared to collect information from knows exactly what that meant. We assumed it was a book of vast knowledge, relating information on all the systems needed to run this spaceship. This is my attempt to recreate that user's manual. After everything that has happened since we left Earth, the genome wars, the Soviet uprising, the mass executions after Steve's fertility crimes, I cannot believe what the science factions are doing. I fear they are attempting a year zero event to restart history. So I hide this, the original and only copy. Well, if you find this and read it, please teach others. The massive losses of knowledge we are suffering at the hubris of man is unfathomable. Jessica of the Botanist's Habitation Sphere 7. Year 359 after launch. Derek's hands clenched the book tighter as he finished reading, his pulse quickening. The weight of the words settled on him, thick and heavy. Launch? Spaceship? His stomach twisted into knots. What the actual fuck, he muttered under his breath. The more he thought about it, the worse it got. The way the words were structured, it was wrong. It wasn't just the writing style, it was the way the author used certain terms like they were more titles than words. Science factions. The technology class. The creators. The meaning behind the words had been lost, but the reverence remained, just like the way Z had spoken about rooms with such weight. Derek let out a slow, controlled breath and carefully flipped through more of the decaying pages. Most of them were instructions, weirdly detailed and archaic. He recognized some of the systems. VHS players. Cassette tapes. CRT televisions. The pages were like old technical manuals, listing proper procedures for ancient technology. Others were more wild, computer systems that were completely foreign to him, operating methods that seemed more sci-fi than real. And then, one page caught his eye. It was earmarked, its edges frayed from repeated handling. The heading read: Procedures for the operation of a cryochamber. Derek's breath hitched. The instructions had been altered, added to over the years. Little illustrations were scrawled in the margins, guesses at what the text meant. He traced a finger over the ink sketches, some clearer than others. If he were to follow the pictures alone, the process would have him pull the emergency release. That, in turn, would drop the entire door off the chamber. His stomach dropped. The text did warn of that possibility, but the pictures didn't. That poor woman. Derek closed the book, pressing it against his lap as he exhaled sharply. He leaned his head back against the wall, staring at the rusted ceiling above them, feeling the weight of everything settle into his bones. Please, he whispered to no one, don't let it be a spaceship. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping, praying. Please, not a spaceship. Chapter 5. After Derek had put the book down, the kids relaxed, but they didn't fully let go of their tension until he tucked it away again, re-hiding it within his waistband. Even then, their shoulders remained stiff, and their eyes flicked toward it, as if fearing it might resurface at any moment. Z and Paige were slow to recover, their breathing uneven. Their bodies seemed weaker than they should have been, like they had been running on fumes for far too long. That worried Derek more than he wanted to admit. But more than that, something about reading in this place had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite place. He felt carsick, like he had just tried to read on a long, bumpy drive. The sensation lingered, even as he moved back from the pulsing red light, blinking hard to clear his vision. Derek let them rest, waiting for some sign that they were ready to keep moving. But before they could signal him, he spoke up. Too much had happened since he'd woken up. Nothing made sense yet. His patience was wearing thin, and he needed answers. Even if these kids barely understood the world they lived in, something had to give. He knew, however, that if he wanted to get anywhere, he had to be careful. Deliberate. He could see it in their faces, press too hard, and they would clam up completely. So, he planned his approach. Keeping his voice slow and measured, he asked, "Where are you taking me?" Z and Paige exchanged a glance, their little faces scrunching in thought. But it was Z who answered, his thick cant rolling out of his mouth like a song. Junktown 3. Derek had been expecting that. Z had mentioned it before. He nodded slightly, keeping his frustration in check. "Why are you taking me there?" Z grinned, happy to explain. "To Zark. The good operator. He told us to take the scary lady to the Glow Man, so now we bring back the Glow Man." Derek chewed on that. He had already gathered as much, but it was good to have it confirmed. Zark was the one who had sent them. But that only led to more questions. He exhaled slowly and asked the big one. "Are we on a spaceship?" The reaction was immediate. Z and Paige exchanged that look again, the same wide-eyed fear they had given him the last time he asked something they found dangerous. Even when he expected it, the way they recoiled still put his nerves on edge. Paige was the one who answered this time, but her response wasn't what he expected. She just blinked at him in confusion and said, "We in resting hole?" It wasn't even an answer, it was a question, as if Derek was incapable of seeing the world around them for what it was. He let out a sharp breath and rubbed his temple, frustration mounting. They don't even understand the question. Okay, he muttered, let's start with something you would understand. He turned to Z and locked eyes with him. Why do you call me Glow Man? Z and Paige both sighed, their small, malformed faces twisting with frustration, the way kids did when an adult asked them something they assumed was obvious. Glow Man was painting by the voice, Z said, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. When voice made everything. Derek stilled. He turned those words over in his head. The voice. The thing that had made everything. Then, like pieces slotting into place, he understood. His cryochamber. His face had been visible through the small glass window of the pod. The light inside had been dim, glowing faintly in the darkness. Frozen in place, trapped in stillness, his image must have looked flat, like a painting. And to these kids, who had no frame of reference, no understanding of how things really worked, they must have thought he was a real painting. Derek swallowed hard, suddenly feeling lightheaded. Why did you want me? He asked, struggling to keep his voice level. Why did you wake me up? Z and Paige both giggled at the same time, an eerie, childish noise that sent a chill down Derek's spine. The scary lady, they chimed together. Derek's stomach dropped. The woman. The one crushed against the door. He clenched his jaw, feeling frustration surge in his chest again. He was running in circles. These kids didn't know anything. They were just messengers, delivering him from one confusing nightmare to another. He was about to push further, to demand something more concrete, when a deep, rhythmic vibration rolled through the walls. The entire space around them shook. Derek braced himself as dust rained from the ceiling, the metal groaning in protest. The tremor sent a sharp shudder through the floor, rattling his teeth. He instinctively pressed a hand against the wall, steadying himself. But the kids? They didn't react at all. They rested through the violent shaking like nothing had happened. Like they didn't even notice. As the kids finished their rest, they whispered too low for Derek to hear. He spent his time listening to the dim, rhythmic pulsing of the red floodlight, trying to gauge how much time had passed. There was no real way to tell, but he guessed they had been there for an hour or two, just waiting while the two kids recovered from what seemed to be nothing more than a mild walk. Before they left, Z locked eyes with Derek, then looked back at Paige and nodded. Then, in his thick cant, he spoke. We got question now, Glauman. Paige shifted uncomfortably before blurting out what she had clearly been holding in since they first left the chamber. Why you killed the scary lady? Derek froze. The kids were both staring at him, waiting, watching. He finally understood why they had been whispering. The woman who had opened his chamber, the one who had dragged him out of whatever frozen limbo he had been trapped in, had used an emergency hatch release. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't have been a problem, but the emergency hinges had long since rusted and decayed. When they snapped, the heavy door collapsed forward, crushing her against the catwalk grate. These kids thought he had done it on purpose. Derek's mind reeled. Murderers were people to be feared, and yet Z still seemed to like him. Why? If they thought he had killed someone, why were they still leading him through these tunnels? He took a deep breath, forcing himself to speak slowly, deliberately, in a way they could understand. I did not kill that woman. She died in accident. Z and Paige exchanged glances, their faces shifting between confusion and uncertainty. No powers on lady? Z asked, as if seeking clarification. No, Derek said firmly. No powers. The kids looked at each other again, and Derek could tell they were continuing the conversation they had been whispering about while they rested. Some kind of unspoken communication passed between them, something Derek couldn't quite interpret. Then Z spoke again, this time with a near pleading tone. But powers in Oblak 3. All big nobles stunned. We walk right through. He pointed at the hospital-like badge identifying Derek as Subject 77. Derek exhaled through his nose. He had used words, not powers, but to these kids, it probably looked the same. Maybe it was better if he played into the idea that Z had of him. He needed them to keep leading him, after all. Yeah, I guess I kinda did, little dude, Derek said, shrugging. I used my words to shock him so we could run. He didn't bother to slow his speech or simplify his words, but it didn't matter. The moment the sentence left his mouth, Z and Paige lit up like he had just confirmed Santa Claus was real. Z shot Paige a triumphant look, I told you so. While Paige crossed her arms, clearly annoyed that Z had been right. Then, Paige spoke again, this time with genuine worry. But Glauman too big to take tunnels. Z and Paige take tunnels. We have one scary place left. Even Scary Lady thought the ventsman scary. Derek arched a brow. Ventsman? The kids looked at each other before Paige turned back to him. We gotta walk edge of ventsman. Z nodded solemnly. Glauman promised swear he used power. Keep Z and Paige safe of ventsman. Derek gawked at them. This part of the conversation had gone over his head completely. From what he could tell, the kids were worried about whatever was up ahead and wanted him to promise to keep them safe. He forced a small smile and repeated what he had heard, trying to match their cadence. I, Glauman, promise swear to keep Z and Paige safe with me. Both kids grinned, seemingly satisfied. With that, the group climbed back out from the resting hole, and Derek was immediately reminded of just how awful the world outside their dim red haven was. The air was thick, stale, and heavy with the scent of rust and mold. The tunnel around them was suffocatingly dark, and after adjusting to the faint red glow of the small room, the vast blackness outside seemed even darker. Z and Paige, however, seemed unaffected. Paige, especially, moved without hesitation, slipping into the darkness like she could see just fine. The trio walked for what must have been another 30 minutes, at least, as far as Derek could guess. There was no real way to track time down here. The endless, echoing roar that had filled the air since his awakening was now slowly drowned out by something new. A mechanical whooping. A rhythmic whoosh 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 that grew louder and louder the further they walked. Something ahead was moving. Circling. And for the first time since waking up, Derek felt something new against his skin. A breeze. Derek crouched low as he followed Z and Paige through the tight, dust-laden tunnel, his breath shallow. The rhythmic vibrations of the structure around them had become background noise by now, a near constant reminder that the place they traversed was alive in its own twisted way. It groaned, trembled, and occasionally shuddered hard enough to send flakes of rust drifting from the ceiling like dry autumn leaves. They moved in single file, the kids ahead of him, scuttling over thick bundles of forgotten wires and ducking under low-hanging beams that were bent and corroded, as though the area itself had tried to collapse under its own age. Derek had just adjusted to the claustrophobic march when he noticed something strange about the tunnel. The walls changed. They were no longer the prefabricated metal panels he had seen elsewhere, the same stripped-down, utilitarian designs that had been repeated in every corridor. Here, the walls were uneven, crude. A breach. Derek hesitated, running his fingers over the jagged edges where the tunnel had been forcefully expanded. This wasn't part of the original construction. Someone had dug their way in. Z and Paige didn't seem to notice. They moved past the irregularity without a second glance, their bare feet padding against the ancient dust-coated floor. Derek's stomach twisted as he stepped over the threshold, suddenly aware that they were no longer walking through corridors, but something else, the innards of a machine too large for him to comprehend. He had to watch his step. Some of the wires underfoot had been here so long that they had petrified into rigid formations, like cave stalagmites made of dust and neglect. The kid slipped between metal pipes and through small access holes that forced Derek to crouch, crawl, and sometimes even drag himself forward on his elbows. The deeper they went, the more Derek felt like some voyeur in a horror movie, sneaking through the vents of an evil villain's lair, hoping not to be caught. But what he saw when they emerged stopped him cold. Ahead, the narrow crawlway opened into an immense void, a chasm so wide and dark that it could have swallowed a stadium whole. And in that chasm, the fans turned. Massive blades, taller than buildings, spun lazily in the darkness, their metal frames groaning with each rotation. They connected to vast ventilation shafts, feeding into the unseen depths of the chasm. The air moved in unnatural gusts, whipping around them, creating unpredictable currents that sent Derek's balance wavering on the ledge. The sounds of rushing wind filled his ears, drowning out everything else. In the shadows, something else loomed. Platforms, dozens of them, suspended in the void, tethered to the walls by rusted chains and twisted cabling. The structures were a patchwork of scavenged metal and fan parts, turned into shanty homes that clung to the cavern's walls like barnacles on a shipwreck. Some were mere planks of metal tied together, others more intricate, housing vents and old piping that had been hammered into crude shelters. The sight of them made Derek's stomach twist. People lived here. And on the closest platform, slumped in a creaking chair, sat the fattest man Derek had ever seen. His body gleamed with sweat, rolls of flesh spilling over the sides of his perch. The man wore only two things, a helmet from an old space suit and a loincloth made of braided hair. His thick sausage-like fingers clutched a cane, its head warped into something resembling a mace. His spectacles glinted against the dim glow of a control panel, oversized and small at the same time, as if the lenses were meant for a different face, yet had long since become part of his bloated features. The control panel was hooked to braided ropes of skin and hair that connected his machine to the vents. Derek could see from here the man could restrict the flow of air using these ropes. Derek barely had time to process the grotesque image before Z let out a sharp whisper. Light! Derek followed his gaze and saw lanterns cresting a distant pipe hill. Flickering, swaying with the wind, held aloft on long sticks. A patrol. Chapter 6. Z's voice was urgent, barely audible over the wind. Ventsman. They kill maim anyone who walk by. Ventsman say at his house. Derek didn't need to be told twice. The shadows of figures moved behind the lanterns, treading carefully over the metal beams, stepping across the pipes and vents like seasoned predators. They carried weapons, long hooked poles, bladed tools that looked like they were meant for maintenance but had clearly been repurposed for violence. Z and Paige were already moving, climbing the web of pipes and cables, balancing on air vents that dropped off into nothingness on either side. The wind howled, tugging at their small forms, but they moved like it was second nature. Derek swallowed hard and forced himself forward. He barely managed to grab hold of a bundle of wires when the patrol's flickering lights passed close to his hiding spot. His gut screamed at him to retreat, to go back into the tunnels, but he'd be lost without Z and Paige. So he moved. One hand after the other, gripping cables, scaling the metal cliffside like a man who had never done a pull-up in his life. The wind buffeted him from all sides. His muscles screamed, but adrenaline kept him from looking down. The moment he hauled himself onto the air vent with a hollow clang, he knew he'd made a mistake. The structure echoed. The sound cut through the rushing wind like a gunshot. Derek froze. The lanterns in the distance paused. Z hissed and waved him forward. Move. Move. Glowman, move quick. Derek forced himself onward, the vent vibrating beneath his feet as he followed the kids higher into the chasm's darkness. From their new vantage, the scale of the place became clearer. There were more patrols, scattered along the walls, dozens of tiny lantern lights moving through the abyss like fireflies. They had to hurry. The paths they took weren't made for humans to walk on. They leapt from vent to pipe, from bundle of wires to unstable beams, each movement sending Derek's stomach into his throat. Then, the vibrations came. A pulse shuddered through the vents, rattling the metal around them like the beating of a war drum. Z and Paige immediately dropped to their stomachs, clinging to the vent's surface like frightened animals. Derek wasn't so lucky. The shockwave almost sent him tumbling. He scrambled, gripping the edges of the vent, his body tilting dangerously over the chasm. His foot slipped. His stomach plunged. For a second, Derek was weightless. Then, Z's hand caught his sleeve, his tiny, wiry frame pulling with all the strength he had. Derek gasped, chest heaving, as he dragged himself back onto the metal. They continued the climb in silence, breathless and wary. It felt like hours before Z pointed ahead. Look. Derek followed his finger. A hole in the wall, barely visible in the darkness. Their destination. The three of them hauled themselves over the final ledge, panting, heaving, drained. Even Derek's body ached from the climb, and the kids looked wiped. But they were almost there. One last push. One last step into the unknown. Derek took a deep breath and followed. Derek hauled himself over the ledge, his breath ragged, limbs trembling with exhaustion. Even with his body screaming for rest, he forced himself forward. The kids had stopped for only a few moments before they were moving again, far too eager to be home to let their exhaustion slow them down. Home. That word felt alien in Derek's mind. He hadn't processed much of what had happened since waking up, hadn't had time to think between the desperation of escape and the unrelenting madness of wherever the hell he was. But now, with his body heavy, his mind sluggish, and his breath short, reality pressed down on him in ways he hadn't yet faced. How long had it been since he'd slept? His sense of time had been obliterated. He thought about the bar, about Jason, about Tina, about the moment a cloth had covered his face and his world had gone black. He had no clue how much time had passed since then. Hours? A day? More? The exhaustion settled into his bones, but still, he followed. The two kids in front of him, despite their own weariness, seemed excited now, almost giddy. Their steps picked up, their postures straightened, and their energy returned as they moved forward. They weren't just trying to escape anymore, they were returning home. And then, Derek finally saw it. Junktown 3. The moment he laid eyes on it, he knew, this place was not what he had expected. The name had conjured images of something at least somewhat structured in Derek's mind. A place meant for people. When they had called it a church, his brain had immediately latched onto the idea of something familiar, an old, run-down building, maybe. But Junktown 3 wasn't a town. It was a clog. A six-way junction of crisscrossing hallways and intersecting tunnels that should have served as a central hub for movement. Instead, it had been devoured by people, consumed by desperate hands who had nowhere else to go. The junction was barely recognizable as a passageway anymore. It was drowning in bodies, in filth, in makeshift structures that had been hammered, tied, or carved into the walls themselves. People had built homes out of whatever they could find. Tents made of scavenged tarps and plastic sheets clung to the metal framework like tumors. Holes had been dug into the walls, creating cramped, cave-like dwellings that reeked of human bodies and decay. Some structures were more advanced, patchwork buildings of stacked crates and metal plating that looked like they'd been stitched together over generations. Derek had seen images of slums in third world countries before, ads begging for donations with pictures of hungry children standing in front of collapsing huts. This was worse. This was not a town. It was a graveyard that hadn't realized it was dead yet. And the air. Derek hadn't noticed it at first, but now, as he walked deeper, it clawed at him. Thin. Too thin. Every breath he took felt shallow, incomplete. His lungs strained, his chest tightening as if there simply wasn't enough oxygen to go around. Then he realized, there wasn't. Derek looked around, watching the people, and suddenly, it all made sense. The way they moved, slow, deliberate, like they were conserving energy. The way they breathed, short, careful inhales. The way no one ever took a deep breath. The people of Junktown 3 were starving for air. Derek swallowed hard, his body screaming at him to turn around, to go back to the vents, to find anywhere else but here. But there was nowhere else. And Z was already leading him forward, deeper into the streets of this makeshift ruin. Despite the clear poverty and suffering, the people here were far more normal than the twisted bodies of Oblok 3. There were no glaring mutations, no grotesque figures that made his stomach churn. They looked like Z and Paige, dirty, malnourished, dressed in little more than scraps, but human. Which somehow made it worse. The fact that this was what counted as normal here. The eyes were everywhere. Derek felt them as he passed, stares drilling into his back. People stopped in their tracks, some whispering, some simply gawking. He looked different. His clothes were cleaner, his face unscarred, his body healthier. Compared to these people, he may as well have glowed in the dark. Z didn't seem to care. The boy led them forward, weaving through the shantytown with ease, heading toward the largest structure in sight. Derek hadn't noticed it at first, but now, as they drew closer, it stood out. A cone-shaped building, covered in a patchwork tent-like dome, with a narrow entryway that led inside. Derek followed them through the entrance, expecting more of the same. But the inside was different. The moment they stepped in, Derek felt it. It looked like a church. Or at least, something that had been forced into the shape of one. A long, narrow hall led to what should have been an altar. Only there was no altar. Instead, a rug had been drawn onto the metal floor, painted or stitched in crude imitation of something sacred. And at the end of the hall, where a cross or a pulpit should have stood, was something else entirely. A music system. Speakers. A cassette and CD player. An ancient, towering machine, covered in dust and reverence. And kneeling before it, cleaning it with careful, almost holy precision, was the man Z had been searching for. Zark. The boy broke into a run, shouting his name. Zark. The man flinched in surprise, turning sharply. His eyes widened as he saw the kids, then widened even further as they settled on Derek. Derek stopped in his tracks. For the first time, someone was staring at him not with confusion, or hunger, or detached curiosity, but with shock. Z didn't seem to notice. The boy launched himself at the man, clinging to him. Zark hesitated, just for a second, then wrapped his arms around the child, returning the embrace. His hands were thin. His body gaunt. He wore robes that looked like a cross between a monk's habit and a mechanic's jumpsuit, patched and stitched with fabric that didn't match. And around his neck, he wore a lanyard. Derek couldn't make out the details from here, but it was there. Zark finally looked up, stepping forward. He didn't speak immediately. He just stared at Derek. Studied him. Derek stared back. Something about this man felt different. And then, finally, Zark spoke. His voice was crisp. Clear. English, but with an accent Derek couldn't place. "Hello," he said, slow and deliberate. "I am Operator Zark." His eyes didn't leave Derek's face. "And who would you be?" Derek almost collapsed in relief. For the first time since waking up, he had finally found someone who could talk to him. Someone who could explain what the hell was happening. Z's voice cut through the silence before Derek had a chance to speak. The boy spoke in deep cant, his words thick with reverence. "Glow man from painting," Z said, his small chest puffed with pride. "He got power, Zark. Insta-talk." The words made Zark tense. His eyes flickered with something Derek couldn't quite place, fear, wonder, skepticism? But before the kids could continue, the man hushed them with a simple motion, his thin, wiry fingers raising in a slow command. Then, he turned his full attention to Derek. "What say you, Glow Man?" There was a weight to his words, a careful, measured caution. The man's voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, an edge of nerves, a tremor that barely made it past his lips. Derek swallowed, trying to push down his own rising anxiety. He needed clarity. He needed answers. And if this guy, this operator Zark, was the one who could give them, then Derek wasn't about to let some bizarre honorifics and misplaced worship get in the way. Dude. I'm actually Derek," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I let these little kids call me Glow Man because I had no idea what the hell was going on, man." His words spilled out faster than he could filter them, anxiety bubbling over into a breathless confession. Derek told him everything. From the moment he was kidnapped, to the sterile room, to the freezing chamber. Waking up to screaming kids. The gagging, rotting stench of Block 3. The twisted figures, the vents, the climb, the near death. He spoke without pausing, the words tumbling out in a frantic, gasping rush, as if saying them all at once would somehow make them less insane. By the time he finished, Derek was breathless. Zark sat completely still. Z and Paige had stopped fidgeting, their eyes wide, their expressions unreadable. The weight of Derek's words hung in the air like static, thick and suffocating. And then, finally, Zark inhaled sharply. "That is quite the story," the man said, his voice measured, careful. "I think I understand most of it." He looked down at the children. "We have awakened him from the painted world," he murmured, "a human from the Creator's world." The kids stared at Derek anew, their awe redoubled. Then, without hesitation, Zark gestured to them. "Run along outside," he instructed. "Tell the others, the tapes will play, but no one enters the church tonight." Z beamed at the order, his chest puffing with importance, while Paige simply nodded. "And," Zark added, "I will make sure you both get extra food at the orphanage tonight." The two kids scampered away in an instant, their small bodies slipping out the entrance before Derek could even blink. Now, it was just the two of them. Zark studied Derek with a new intensity, his gaze calculating. "I understand little of what you speak, Derek," he admitted. Derek barely registered his words before something caught his eye, the lanyard. Except, it wasn't a lanyard. It was a cassette tape, strung around the man's neck like a relic. The plastic casing was old and worn, the label long since peeled away. But someone had painted over it, careful, deliberate strokes. 5 out of 7. That was what it depicted. 5. What? Derek's mind raced, but he couldn't make sense of it. Zark noticed his distraction. "You have questions," he said, wary. Derek refocused. "Yeah, I guess that, dude, but I've kinda gotten used to it today." He took another shallow breath in the thin, stale air. "Do you know anything about the people from my world?" Zark shook his head. "No. I do not." Then his expression darkened. "But I must ask. Where is the nun?" It took Derek a second to realize what he meant. "The nun?" Derek muttered, frowning. "Oh. You mean the scary lady?" Zark nodded solemnly. Derek sighed, shaking his head. "I didn't kill her, if that's what you're worried about. She got crushed when the pod door fell." He hesitated, then added, "And no, I didn't want her dead. Not even a little." Zark studied him for a moment, then nodded again, satisfied with the answer. Derek's curiosity got the better of him. "Who was she?" he asked. Zark exhaled through his nose. "She was part of a group I am secretly a part of," he admitted. "A group that seeks knowledge in the Bach." That word again. "The Bach." Zark continued. "She was a nun of the Order of Our Martyred Lady, a different faith than mine," he explained. "I am an operator of the Church of the Holy Tapes." Derek almost choked. "The what now?" Zark didn't seem to notice Derek's confusion. "The nun had been following the clues of the Bach," he murmured. "She believed she had deciphered the way to resurrect a creator from the pictographs." He looked at Derek with something almost like fear. And she may have been right. Derek's brain shut down for a second. A creator. Was that what they thought he was? His mind raced for a new approach. These people had lost so much knowledge. Clearly, they didn't understand his context. So, instead of arguing, Derek pulled the book from his waistband. Zark's reaction was immediate. The moment his eyes landed on it, he sucked in a sharp breath, his whole body tensing. Then, in a shouted whisper, he exclaimed one word. "The Bach." His eyes darted around the room, paranoia creeping into his features. "Put it away," he ordered, voice hushed. Derek hesitated. Why? Zark's jaw clenched. The nun did not imply that she held the Bach, he muttered. Keep it hidden. If the Pope. A chime cut him off. Derek recognized the sound immediately. A PA system. Old. Distorted. Ancient. Zark whirled toward the music system, his reverence palpable. He pressed a single button, painted gold from years of use. The voice that followed made Derek's skin crawl. The crackling voice from the speakers was a monster of sound, a spliced abomination of cheery self-help guides and sterile corporate policy. Its tone fluctuated wildly, as if the recording had been butchered and reassembled without care for human rhythm. Derek flinched as the system blared to life, the distortion turning even the softest words into an overwhelming presence. Minutes are your life. Spend wisely. The voice was reassuring, but cold, the kind of thing you'd hear while waiting for customer service, hollowed out of real emotion. Excessive use of minutes will incur self-inflicted fines. A conscious user is a good user. Derek's stomach twisted. The chime of a faux cash register rang through the speaker, a soundbite lifted straight from an ancient financial advice program. Then the voice resumed, with the same uncanny salesman's cadence. Brevity is efficiency. Efficiency is longevity. Speak less, live more. Derek cast a glance at Zark. The man's head was bowed, his lips moving silently as if in prayer. Jesus Christ. He believes this. The voice shifted, this time to a chipper woman's tone, obviously part of a different recording. Overages are final. No refunds. Abuse of minutes will lead to loss of minutes. A responsible user understands their limits. The static groaned, swallowing a chunk of the next phrase, before resolving into something too eerily cheerful for the message it carried. Do not waste what has been allotted. There is no renewal. Derek felt ice crawl down his spine. This wasn't a religion. It was a prison. The fear in Z's voice, Paige's hesitance, the way everyone spoke in cant, in clipped, controlled words, they weren't just ignorant. They were terrified. Terrified of spending too many minutes. Terrified of speaking too much. Terrified that the moment they crossed an invisible line, their lives would run out like an expired contract. The tape clicked. The message was over. And just like that, Zark pressed the rewind button. The tape began to whir backwards, resetting for the next sermon. Then, he turned to Derek. And just like that, his English was gone. He spoke only in cant now, his words broken, stilted. Derek was too exhausted to fight it. He barely processed it when Zark motioned him to a bed. And then, the bed. A hammock, tucked behind a hidden panel. The fabric was ancient, slick with human grease, damp with age. Derek didn't care anymore. He crawled in, shut the panel, and let the darkness swallow him whole. Within seconds, he was gone.